Spotlight on South Korea. I'm Steve Petrus. I'm chairman of the board of the Cleveland Council on World Affairs, and I'd like to welcome everyone here, announce some programs, and then I have a few announcements myself. So, the next event that you should put on your calendar is June 3rd, where there will be a screening of a film called A Small Act. And this is going to be at the Morai Lecture Hall at the Cleveland Museum of Art. I think Morley Lecture Hall at the Cleveland Museum of Art. I hope you can all attend. It's about, it's a film about a small act of kindness and how it potentially changed the world. And then there will be a discussion afterwards about the movie and its effect. Then we'd like all of you to come to our annual meeting, which is going to be on June 15th. It'll start with a reception at 5:30. It's going to be at the Shaker Heights Country Club, and we'll not only conduct our annual meeting where we'll elect our new board members and our officers, but we will have as our guest speaker Dr. Cosgrove, CEO of the Cleveland Clinic Foundation. So we hope you can all meet that. At this point, I just want to add, is there anybody here who's not a member of the Cleveland Council on World Affairs? Raise your hand. Now, it's your civic duty to join the Cleveland Council on World Affairs. What we're all about, by the way, is understanding international relations. And if that's something that motivates you, and obviously it does, because you're all here tonight to learn about South Korea, we encourage you to join. We're looking for active participants and active members. There's a lot of need for understanding in the world today, and we hope we're your first stop at gaining understanding. I'd like to introduce now Richard Pritchard, who is the Administrative Director of the Cleveland Council on World Affairs and also the Director of our Education Program. He is going to do the introduction of our panelists tonight. Richard.
Thank you very much, Steve, and again, welcome to everyone here. I have the distinct honor of introducing our panelists for this evening. And before I do, I just want to acknowledge one of the members of our audience, Kevin O'Donnell, former Chief of the Country for South Korea with the Peace Corps, U.S. Peace Corps, and then former Director of the U.S. Peace Corps. So, Kevin, welcome. The first of our panelists is Ambassador Charles Jack Pritchard, who's president of the Korea Economic Institute in Washington. Prior to joining the Institute, he was a visiting fellow at the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C. from December 2003 until February 2006. At Brookings, he focused on U.S. policy towards North Korea, as well as the evolving nature of the United States-Japan foreign and security relationship. Ambassador Pritchard served as ambassador and special envoy for negotiations the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, and United States representative to the Korean Peninsula Energy Development Organization, the administration of President George W. Bush, from April 2001 until September 2003. Previously, he served as Special Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs and Senior Director for Asian Affairs in the administration of President Bill Clinton. During the Clinton administration, Ambassador Pritchard was also the Director of Asian Affairs in the National Security Council and Deputy Chief Negotiator for the four-party peace talks, which aimed at reducing the tensions on the Korean Peninsula. Ambassador Pritchard is a former United States Army officer and attaché in Tokyo, Japan. He received his bachelor's in political science from Mercer University in Macon, Georgia, and an MA in International Studies from the University of Hawaii and a diploma from the Japanese National Institute for Defense Studies in Tokyo. Welcome, Ambassador Pritchard. Our next panelist is Greg Scarlatoiu, Director of Business Issues and Public Affairs for the Korean Economic Institute in Washington, responsible for managing outreach programs to educate Americans on the developments in Korea and U.S.-Korea relations both inside and outside of Washington, D.C. Greg authors a column on the developments in U.S.-Korea business and economic relations in KEI's monthly newsletter, Insight. He has written on the applicability of the Eastern European experience to the North Korea context in the Institute's exchange and in the Korea language press. He has over 6 years of international development consulting experience as a manager and cost-effectiveness analyst contracted by USAID, the World Bank, and the Asian Development Bank. He has authored a weekly Korean language column for Radio Free Asia and has conducted assessments of compliance with International Labor Organization core conventions in the Republic of Korea. Rick holds a Master of Arts in Law and Diplomacy from the Fletcher School at Tufts University and an MA and a BA in International Relations from Seoul National University. He is fluent in Korean, French, and Romanian. And our third panelist is Joshua Huck. Joshua is the Republic of Korea Unit Chief in the Office of Korea Affairs at the Department of State. Prior to this, he served as the Deputy Chief of the Political Economic Affairs Section at the U.S. Embassy in Sofia, Bulgaria. He also served as Political Military Affairs Officer in Tokyo, Japan, as a Consular Office in Shanghai, Shanghai, China, and as a Desk Officer in the Office of Chinese Affairs. Joshua holds a BA from Johns Hopkins University and an MA from the International University of Japan in Niigata. He has also studied at the Johns Hopkins University School for Advanced International Studies in Bologna, Italy. He is a Northeast Ohio native and a graduate of Brecksville Broadview Heights High School, and we're also honored to have his parents. So without further ado, let our panel begin making presentations, and after their presentations, then we'll have opportunity for a question and answer session. So I think Josh is first.
Okay. Is this, can everyone hear me? Okay, well, first, thanks so much to everyone for coming, and thanks very much to the Cleveland Council on World Affairs for arranging this. As a native Clevelander who works in Foreign Affairs, your mission is near and dear to my heart, so thank you very much for making this possible. Okay. All right. I think we're set. I want to say just a quick word about my organization, the Department of State. As you know, the State Department is the federal organization responsible for the conduct of foreign relations. I think to an extent we're more familiar with the work of our military or even intelligence personnel overseas, and the work of our diplomatic officers is not as well known. But just like we have military officers that work all over the world supporting U.S. interests, we also, the State Department has a group of foreign service officers who work all around the world at our embassies and consulates to advance U.S. interests. So if anyone's actually interested in knowing more about the State Department or the Foreign Service, I'd be very happy to talk to you after this session. Okay, so jumping into it here about Korea. Got a couple of nice slides here for you. Always a little more interesting with pictures. There we go. And I should say at the top, although I am a U.S. government employee, all the opinions and generalizations I'll be making here are my own and not the government position. I should give that a little disclaimer. Okay, well, starting off, I don't think we really have the scope here to go into a great deal of history on the Korean Peninsula, but obviously it's a part of the world where the specter of history looms very large on the shape of the present. It was that, as you know, a country that has been essentially artificially divided north and south by a twist of fate, and it's during that critical period where two halves of Korea took very different routes that have brought them to very different places today. I'm going to focus primarily here on our relationship with the South, and then we'll have a chance for Ambassador Pritchard to get into more detail on the relations with the North, and Greg will go into the economic portion. But I guess I want to put the bottom line up front, what I want you to take away from this today. And I think that's, to an extent, I think as Americans we have a tendency to focus on the Korean Peninsula from our perspective of the war, since that was sort of our formative experience in Korea. And I think there's a tendency to still look at the peninsula in that framework. And I think there's a possibility in that we could miss some important developments that have happened over the last 60 years. I think in the past there was a tendency for Americans to look at the Korean Peninsula as sort of a regional security problem. that it was an issue we had to worry about, and that South Korea was important to us primarily in terms of North Korea only, defending it versus the North, containing North Korea, and that was the reason it was in the U.S. interest. That, if it was ever true, is completely not true today. The relationship has changed fundamentally, and that's why I put at the start a global partnership, because that's really what has emerged in our relationship with South Korea. That we don't just have regional interests in Korea anymore. We're not just partners on the peninsula watching out for what the North is doing. We're now cooperating all over the world. Korea is now our 7th largest trading partner. It's one of the largest economies in the world in its own right. And we're working together in places completely separate from the peninsula, in places like the Middle East, in Haiti, in counter-piracy, in non-proliferation. So, I think we need to sort of, while we're still taking stock of the North Korean situation, it remains a challenge for all of us. We do have to look and see what's new about the relationship and not lose sight of those, what's evolved in the relationship in the interim. So I'd like to go into a little more detail about that. And really it starts with values. We share with Korea a basic set of core values that really distinguish our relationship from a lot of others. This is not an alliance of convenience against the North, but this is a fundamental relationship that is broad and deep and goes across all of these areas that are listed above. I don't know if anyone had a chance to catch the President's State of the Union address earlier this year, but if you were counting, he mentioned the Republic of Korea more than any other country in the world. And that only one of those was North Korea mentioned. All of the others were related to education, economics, science, clean energy, green growth, things like this. The two presidents actually had a very close relationship. I think every president has a couple of other presidents they sort of hit it off with, and actually by chance, Lee Huck is one of those presidents that has that very close personal relationship with President Obama. And that has an effect all the way up and down the government. I think at every level we have that really productive, deep contact. So it's really fair to say that our relationship now is as good as it's ever been. The two countries are incredibly close. But we're not just agreeing on things, we're agreeing on more things, and we're doing more things together all around the world. The economic partnership, again, I'm going to keep this part brief because Greg is a real expert in this area, and I'll let him go into more detail. But I can't neglect a little chart that shows something about what's known as the miracle on the Han, the really dramatic, you could say miraculous growth of the Korean economy, particularly looking at in the 80s and the 90s. Of course, it's no secret that there is a massive disparity between the North and the South. I've got Korea on here as the 12th and the 13th largest. I think I heard you say 14th before.
15th that shifts quite often.
I imagine depending if you're doing purchasing power parity or gross domestic product versus national product. Anyway, the point is a massive economy that went from being truly a poor developing state to a truly world economic power, and it's our 7th largest trading partner. And of course, it's no secret that the North is in an entirely different spot. The per capita GDP estimates, again, are very difficult to make, but even the tentative efforts they made at reform, for example, the currency reform that they tried last year was a colossal failure, and if anything, set them further back. To try to illustrate it more dramatically, you may have seen this picture in other places, but obviously the lights are a sign of economic prosperity and commercial activity, and the contrast couldn't be more stark, not only with the South, but even compared to the border areas with China and Russia. And those border areas are not particularly densely populated, but you can see just the massive difference. Whereas the North has pursued a strategy of self-reliance, or you could say complete closure in terms of its economic system, the South Korea is very dramatically pursuing free trade agreements all around the world. Many of those are already in place, but you'll see in the two that are awaiting ratification, two of those are with us and with the EU, so two massive economies that South Korea is preparing to sign trade deals with, which will fundamentally change the nature of the way that we interact. One of those, as I said, is the Korea, we call KORUS, the Korea-U.S. Free Trade Agreement. And again, I'll defer to Greg to talk about that in more detail, except to say that this is, for us, assuming it's ratified by Congress, which should happen sometime this year, it will be the largest trade agreement for the United States since NAFTA. And if it's that important for us, you can imagine how, in comparative scale, how important it is for the Korean economy. And so, the amount of trade that will create and the amount that will increase our economy, but then also all of the other linkages that makes, the business connections, the personal connections, will have a profound effect on our two countries and continue to draw us ever more closely together. Okay, so moving over to the security partnership, I've got a couple more montage for you here. But it really is a security partnership that enabled the economic miracle that took place in Korea to happen, because it provided that umbrella, that blanket of security. The partnership that the U.S. and South Korea formed during those incredibly difficult years during the war is truly something that sets our relationship apart from others. Our two countries came out of that as such close allies that has set the tone for our relationship, and it remains an incredibly strong security partnership today. The U.S. has right now about 28,500 troops stationed in Korea full-time. You'll see the majority of those are Army. Our security partnership has been incredibly successful over the years at deterring North Korean aggression, and that partnership remains incredibly strong. Obviously, the threat from we believe the threat from North Korea has evolved over the years. Now we assess that the threat of a direct invasion is less, but as we saw last year with the sinking of the South Korean vessel the Cheonan and the attack on Yeongjong-do Island, the North Korean threat remains very real. The bases that are listed there are a proposal to reduce our overall footprint of our forces in Korea, maintaining the same number, but just reducing the number of bases that we would have, and overall moving our forces into clusters toward the south. Just say a word, OPCON, and here apologies for the sort of military's acronym, but that's operational control. And that's been got a lot of headlines last year. But to explain it, basically, just go back to explain that the gentleman on the right in the picture, that's General Sharp, is the commander of U.S. Forces Korea. But he wears essentially three hats. In addition to the commander of U.S. Forces Korea, he is also the commander of the United Nations Command. You'll remember that during the war period, it wasn't just the United States and South Korea fighting against the North, but there was a UN command that was set up. And that UN command still exists, and representatives from those other UN countries are still present in Korea. And its leader is General Sharp. But on top of that, the third hat he wears is as the Combined Forces Commander, which is a joint U.S.-South Korean construct. And until 1994, most Americans didn't know this, but until 1994, our USFK commander, so General Sharp, was the commander over all forces in Korea and had overall responsibility for the defense of Korea, both in peacetime and wartime. Now, in 1994, peacetime operational control was handed back to the South Korean government. But even still, even that's a sort of unusual relationship, because it would essentially mean that if tomorrow there were a war on the peninsula, all of a sudden General Sharp would then take command over all forces and would have the overall responsibility for all military operations on the peninsula. And that's an unusual state of affairs that you really can't find in our other alliances. So the decision was made to return wartime operational control back to South Korea as well. Now, it's going to take place in 2012, but at the request of the Korean government, that's been delayed until 2015. But still, the overall trend is clear that South Korea is taking an ever greater share of responsibility for its defense, and we have that ever greater trust that in each other that we can continue to defend the peninsula together and deter North Korean aggression. Speaking of North Korea, so I've got a few provocative pictures for you here, and Ambassador Pritchard at some point may have more to say based on his personal experiences in his travels to North Korea. So I won't say a great deal about North Korea here, except to talk just a little bit about the evolving threat that I mentioned. One of the reasons our alliance is evolving is because the North Korean threat is evolving. It used to be the main threat was that at any given time, North Korean forces could pour across the DMZ. Still, there is a conventional threat from North Korea. There's enough artillery across the DMZ to really do just a horrific amount of damage in the south. But more and more, what we're seeing as a threat is a sort of asymmetric threat. Either these kinds of attacks like we saw against the Cheonan, or we saw on the shelling of Yongbyon, or other more global threats. For example, proliferation of missiles, proliferation of military weapons of mass destruction, and so on. So more and more, countering the North Korean threat is not something that can just be done by having a lot of troops on the peninsula. We need a concerted international effort, which is one reason that's led to these different constructs, such as the United Nations Security Council resolutions that led to the four-party and later the six-party talks, which Ambassador Pritchard will get into more detail. I won't go into these in great detail. This is just to show you just a sample of how many there are. So in addition to the threat from North Korea, there's other concerns, and we also have to consider the human rights situation in North Korea, chronic malnutrition, and the overall instability on the peninsula, and the concerns that raises for the South. So obviously North Korea remains foremost on the minds of our military planners and is a key part of our security partnership. But again, going back to my earlier point, it's not the only part. It's not the only thing we're doing together. And I would offer that if tomorrow somehow miraculously North Korea just disappeared and South Korea became an island, South Korea would be an incredibly important ally in the United States. It would remain one of our closest allies anywhere in the world. This is I apologize for the unattractive grayscale slide, but it's sort of appropriate because this is sort of an issue that you don't hear about very much. These are ROK forces, South Korean forces that are deployed overseas. The gray ones are blocks are military deployments. So, and the numbers are how many service members they have there. So, for example, 240 in Haiti, almost 360 in Lebanon, 230 in Afghanistan in a provincial reconstruction team. And off the coast of Somalia, it's a counter-piracy team. This isn't something you hear about a lot, but 20 years ago, it would have been inconceivable that South Korea would have viewed it as having being in its global interest to be in places like Haiti doing reconstruction work or countering piracy, off the coast of Somalia. But over the years now, Korea realizes it is a global player. It has global interests, and the U.S. also sees that this is something we want to work together on. We've learned ourselves that we can't we can't tackle a lot of these global issues on our own. We need help. We need allies, and that's what we have in South Korea. But it's not just military operations that Korea is doing more of. It's also things like development assistance. Most of the world, frankly, is ratcheting back the amount of assistance they're giving to develop and fight poverty around the world. South Korea is going the other direction. And they're a remarkable story in this regard because they're one of the few countries that was an aid recipient, and now they've become an aid donor. And this year their budget is $1.5 billion for that. And in addition, they're taking the lead in a variety of multilateral fora. They hosted the G20 summit last year. They're going to host the high-level forum on development effectiveness in Busan this year in November. And next year they're going to host the nuclear security summit. It's the one the United States hosted last year. So they're not just participating in these forums, they're actually leading these. They're hosting these, and they're actually playing a leadership role in these issues that, in theory, they could just be a free rider on. Maybe you say, well, yeah, development's important, but why does Korea have to do it? Counter-proliferation is important, but why does Korea care? Well, they're not saying that, and in partnership with us, they're tackling those problems. So finally, I just want to say a word, separate from the economic stuff and the security arrangements, just a little on people-to-people exchanges, which are some of the most important things that we do. Until not that long ago, South Korean citizens were required to get visas to come to the United States, which was incredibly burdensome. Now they can come to the United States visa-free for up to 90 days. U.S. citizens have to enjoy the same going to Korea. So it's really created an uptick in tourist and business travel. Also education. Now, on a per capita basis, the ROK sends more students to the United States than any other country. And you can just imagine the profound effect that that has for all of these students studying here, that they go on to become leaders in Korea with this experience of being in the United States. Will have a profound effect on our relationship, and we guarantee that we continue to have this very close, deep relationship on into the future. So, so just to sum up again, Korea is truly our indispensable ally. It's one that we not only have this relationship that was forged from the Korean War, but now has gone on to become something truly global, truly spanning far beyond just the peninsula and just beyond just security affairs. But we have global interests that we're advancing together all around the world. Thank you.
Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to be speaking before you today. I am tasked to address primarily Korea's economy, the main economic and trade issues. As Josh has already mentioned, Korea is the world's 12th, 13th, or 15th largest economy. It is undeniable that Korea is an economic powerhouse. Korea is also a vibrant liberal democracy that has a vibrant civil society empowered by a netizen movement. After all, it is one of the world's most connected countries. Korea is a true role model, both on the economic front and on the political development front for many countries in the developing world. As Josh mentioned, this is a country that used to be a recipient of international humanitarian development assistance, now has become a donor country. I am particularly honored to be speaking today before Sir Kevin O'Donnell, who is an iconic figure all over the world, and especially in Korea. I have to say the Peace Corps has an extraordinary legacy in Korea, and Korea is also the only country that used to be a recipient of Peace Corps assistance and is now deploying its own Peace Corps World Friends of Korea. Undeniably, the U.S.-Korea alliance provided the security necessary for Korea's spectacular economic development. As Josh has already told us, also what the U.S.-Korea alliance provided was markets, open U.S. markets, at a time when Korea needed to nurture its nascent industries. And of course, it took extraordinarily hard work, bold entrepreneurship, and innovation on the part of Koreans in order to achieve the miracle on the river Han. We all know for sure that Korea's economic status, Korea's standing in the world, is certainly a great source of pride for our Korean friends and allies. The achievements of Korea are absolutely impressive. As we all know, Korea is currently the world's top shipbuilder, the world's top producer of LCD displays, the world's second producer of mobile phones, the world's sixth producer of steel, and the world's fifth largest producer of automobiles. Korea came here by beginning early on, concentrating on import substitution, then making a transition to economic growth, driven by Korea's exports, export-driven growth. Korea made a transition from being a producer of footwear, apparel, pretty much light industry, up to the 1960s. Korea made a transition to being a significant producer of steel, petrochemicals, ships, automobiles, chips, electronics. What were some of the distinctive features of the Han River miracle, in addition to the ones that we have already mentioned. A question that is often asked is whether military dictatorship was needed for Korea in order to achieve this level of development. The legacy of the military dictatorship of President Park Chung-hee has certainly been controversial at times, but most Koreans would agree that there were extraordinary accomplishments, primarily due to this transition from import substitution to an export-oriented economy, also due to those 5-year plans that were being put together by Korea's think tanks, and think tanks certainly played a very important role in Korea's development. Many of them are still around, KDI, the Korea Development Institute, our sister institution in Korea, the Korea Institute for International Economic Policy, and others. What also made a difference in Korea, of course, as we all know, there was collusion between business and politics in Korea and elsewhere in Asia. There was a military dictatorship in the Philippines, for example. But what is it that made the true difference in Korea? And several arguments have been made over the years. One argument made is that Korea's competitive civil service examination made a difference. Korea's bureaucrats were competent, highly competent, because they had to pass, and they still have to pass, a highly competitive civil service examination. Another point that has been made over the years was that during the days of President Park Chung-hee, Korea's conglomerates, the chaebols, could get away with quite a lot for as long as they met their export targets. So during those times, during those years of accelerated economic growth, export targets served as a performance measurement mechanism. It is cliche to assume that East Asian countries such as Korea and Japan and now China made it big by means of reverse engineering. We often forget that innovation has been at the center of Korean society since times immemorial, one could say. We have to remember that the world's first ironclad ship, the Kobukson, was made by the Koreans. We have to remember that one of the world's first multiple rocket launchers, the Hwata, was also made by Koreans. When we look at our cell phones these days, you remember that in the early 2000s, there was great competition between two models, the clam model, made by Motorola, and the chocolate bar model. The one firm that came up with the chocolate bar model was a Korean firm, LG. Known until a while back as Lucky Gold Star, of course it's LG now. LG came up with a so-called sushi concept in business, assuming that there is a fast pace in innovation these days, and that products such as cell phones need to have a short shelf life, even when they're on the pricier side. Persuade the consumer that one has always to be after the next generation and the next model. Korea is discussing, and Korea is very serious these days about its low-carbon green growth policy, environmentally friendly technology innovation, especially since President Lee Myung-pak came up with this grand vision of low-carbon green growth in August of 2008. Korea has created at KAIST. We refer to KAIST as Korea's MIT. Koreans refer to MIT as the American KAIST. Of course, KAIST created the OLEV, the Online Electric Vehicle, a very novel and interesting concept, a vehicle that charges from the road. Chargers are installed below, under the road pretty much. Koreans, as you all know, Korean firms are seriously involved in the production of iron lithium batteries. The Chevy Volt, for example, uses a Korean-made iron lithium battery, and so does the Ford Focus Hybrid LG iron lithium batteries. So there is a lot to say about the role of innovation in Korea's economic development. Of course, We also hear about the Korean corporate system and about that Confucian legacy. Of course, Korea's corporate system has been traditionally ruled by those 5 basic human relationships that define Confucianism: ruler to the ruled, father to son, husband to wife, elder brother to younger brother, and friend to friend. There has been unequal heirship in favor of the eldest son. Seniority does matter in personnel management. There is authority, firm authority, but authority also ensures harmony. Obedience to authority and the sense of belonging have been nurtured for decades. Well, for centuries, should I say. There has been some traditional family management within Korea's corporation system, within the chaebol system, and there has been some exclusionism. There has been kinship, as you all know, having gone to the same school, the same high school, the same middle school. High school is extremely important. Being from the same region used to be extremely important, probably less important now, as Korea has been changing, in particular post-1997 crisis. Korea's corporate culture has been changing. There has been diminished influence of the chaebols, of the large corporations. There are more younger top managers with a more westernized mindset. After all, Korea is one of the top 3 foreign student populations in the United States. The other 2 are the world's 2 most populous nations, India and China. This is a whole generation of young Korean people who are being brought up as multicultural, in particular bicultural, practically native speakers of English, very knowledgeable of American culture. I am very confident that very, very positive changes are ahead. Most certainly, we used to know that the United States was Korea's largest trade partner. Of course, we still have very significant trade, 8th or 9th largest export destination for both Korea and the United States. What has changed is the trend of investment. Of course, the United States used to be a major investment in Korea. U.S. investment in Korea used to be much larger by comparison. That has changed. Taking the year 2008 as a point of reference, the United States invested $1.9 billion in Korea, and Korea invested more, significantly more, $3.9 billion in the United States. There are 3 major investments: Samsung Electronics in Texas, Kia Motors in West Point, Georgia, and Hyundai Motors in Montgomery, Alabama. Kia and Hyundai set up shop there, pretty much greenfield investment. These were very depressed communities. Should I dare say, this will pretty much dying communities that will revive and revitalized by this Korean investment, to the extent that West Point, Georgia has been dubbed Kiaville. Last time Pritchard and I had a chance to visit Montgomery, Alabama in early February this year. Also, during the Future of Korea program, it's a truly, truly impressive operation. Investment and trade, yes, the U.S. used to be the top trading partner that Korea had. We're no longer number 1. We're number 4. The first position now belongs to China, followed by Japan and the European Union. Korea, when it comes to trade, is a true role model for others, for reasons that we all understand. This is a country that has practically no mineral resources. This is a country that has to rely on imports of fossil fuel for its energy needs. This is a country that is a very significant manufacturer, a country that relies on trade. Trade is the backbone of the Korean economy. In hard times, protectionism is, of course, very tempting. Since 2008, Korea has provided everybody with a role model that it is not protectionism, but it is free trade that should be the answer to the economic hardship that we have been experiencing. And truly, Korea and India have become the hubs of a web of bilateral free trade agreements spanning South Asia and Northeast Asia. And what we're seeing right now is a degree of integration between South Asia and Northeast Asia never seen before. This is an extraordinary opportunity for everybody else. The U.S. Was more keen on bilateral free trade agreements. The European Union was keen on multilateral trade arrangements. However, the European Union has come to realize that the United States might actually be making significant progress on this front. And particularly what prompted this was the conclusion of the Chorus FTA, the U.S.-Korea Free Trade Agreement in 2007. Now, that agreement hasn't yet been ratified by the U.S. Congress or the Korean National Assembly. The Korea-EU Free Trade Agreement has been ratified, will be ratified soon. Will be ratified soon. There are some technical details that are being worked out right now, involving some issues with translation, amongst other issues. But it is for certain that the EU-Korea FTA will be ratified soon. It has been estimated by the Commerce Department that every $1 billion in new manufactured exports results in the creation of 6,000 new jobs. It is estimated that the Chorus FTA could result in an additional $10 to $11 billion in U.S. exports. So the Chorus FTA would result in the creation of up to 70,000 jobs here in the United States. And we're totaling the creation of about $20 billion in export growth and $40 billion in GDP growth. The benefits are tremendous for us here in the United States. The benefits are great for Korea. When it comes to actual tariffs, the benefits are actually greater for the United States, because the average tariff on Korean products, for example, here in the United States is 3.7%, while the average tariff imposed on U.S. products imported into Korea is higher, 11.2%. Whenever we travel to future of Korea events, it is very important to remember that we need to relate to the local businesses and the local communities. And I would like to bring to your attention that one of Ohio's largest exports to Korea is, for example, refrigeration compressors. Ohio exports about $21 million worth of refrigeration compressors to Korea. There is an 8% tariff on these products. What happens if the EU-Korea FTA is ratified first? Of course, U.S. companies, including Ohio exporters, will face a great disadvantage. It is not so easy to come in at a later stage because your competitors establish their own standards and they establish their own distributor networks. Another company that I would like to bring to your attention is a pipeline development company. Plinko, established in 1949, I believe it has about 100 employees. They make pipeline maintenance and repair fittings. They export to Korea. The tariff is 8%. They will be facing the same great disadvantage if European companies benefited first from a free trade agreement. And of course, it goes without saying that even more than manufacturers, agricultural producers here in the United States stand to win big from a free trade agreement. One of Ohio's major agricultural exports is soybeans. And of course, Korea, many of us or all of us are familiar with Korean food and soybeans. Korea is the world's 10th largest market for soybeans. Could you guess how high the tariff on importing soybeans, U.S. soybeans in Korea is? It is 230.5%. So unless, and if the Chorus FTA were to pass, it would be reduced to zero, phased out to zero over a 15-year period. Unless this happens, of course, Ohio soybeans would stand to lose before their Chinese and South American competitors, who could benefit from much, much lower tariffs. Of course, There are many more benefits. There are strategic benefits. As Josh has mentioned, the passing of the Chorus FTA would indicate that the United States is in Asia to stay. The United States is not disengaging from Asia. The United States is there and will continue to benefit from the extraordinary developments that are happening and will be happening in this part of the world. From Korea's perspective, I always remember what the Korean ambassador to the United States, Ambassador Han Dok-soo, has said on several occasions, that to Korea, the Chorus FTA is much more than simply a free trade agreement. It is a comprehensive reform package that will provide opportunity for stepped-up competition within the Korean market, that will provide opportunity for Korean companies to compete and become more competitive. On the Chorus FTA front, as Josh has mentioned, we are optimistic. Today, House Representative Mike Kelly introduced legislation urging the passage of the Chorus FTA while recognizing all of these merits of the Chorus FTA, so we will hopefully stay optimistic. One issue that I would like to address very quickly, in addition to this great challenge of the Chorus FTA, that, if ratified, will provide the basis for future collaboration over the next decades. If collaboration was driven for the past few decades by security issues and by the need to provide security to the Republic of Korea, the Chorus FTA is certainly sure to take this to the next stage of collaboration between our two countries. What are some of the other challenges that Korea will be facing over the coming years and decades? Certainly, Korea is export dependent and thus vulnerable to external shocks. Thus, Korea needs to find ways to create domestic demand as well, and this low-carbon green growth policy is one way of doing that. Korea is energy dependent and vulnerable to fluctuating and high oil prices. Once again, thus, the need to develop alternative and clean energy sources. Korea is vulnerable, as we have seen over the past few years, to exchange rate fluctuations, even despite the sizable current foreign currency reserve, about $300 billion. Korea, if it is to concentrate on these green industries of tomorrow, will need to hedge against disruptions affecting the supply chain of critical minerals, including rare earth minerals that you have heard a lot about in the press over the past few months. As we all know, China has been controlling its exports, imposing some export quotas after having kicked everybody else out of the market in the 1980s. Korea will continue to be sandwiched between Japanese quality and Chinese prices. Nevertheless, product quality has increased dramatically, and if Korean cars or electronics used to compete on their low prices, that is no longer the case. The product quality and design are truly superb, and Korea has enhanced and maintained its competitive edge. We often hear about the confrontational character of labor relations in Korea. This is yet another challenge that will have to continue to be addressed. Korea, believe it or not, despite those good old family values, is now an aging population. The birth rate is very low. It became an aging society in 2000. It will be an aged society by 2018 and super aged by 2026. The environment will continue to be a challenge. Those decades of accelerated economic development came at the expense of Korea's environment. And, of course, shifting family and corporate relationships and values will also pose a challenge as Eastern and Western values will continue to meet in Korea. There will also be opportunity. Korea will have ample opportunity to play a role as a middle power, bridging the gap between developed and developing nations. And Korea will also have a great opportunity to become Korea already is a responsible exporter of peaceful nuclear technology. Korea concluded in late 2009, I believe, a deal with the United Arab Emirates to export $20 billion worth of peaceful nuclear technology for energy generation. Of course, that being said and done, of all the challenges that Korea has been facing since before the Korean War, that it's still facing, North Korea is one of the greatest, and I will leave it up to Ambassador Pritchard to address that part of our conversation tonight. Thank you very much.
You know, I usually start by saying it's a great pleasure to be here, but I was thinking a little while ago that if you've watched TV, the show Hardball, Chris Matthews usually ends his program with his panelists by saying, "Tell me something I don't know." And if that's the criteria of success of this panel, and I look out to the audience here, and I see that at least 25% of you could be up here giving this informational presentation, I'm in big trouble here. Now, fortunately, we've had two really good speakers, and I've got to tell you that I've done this myself, but I'm a whole lot older. A year ago, went back home and talked to an audience in which my mother was present. That's not easy to do. So I'm in awe of the quality of the presentation that Josh did with both his parents here. I don't think I can top that. And I've got to also tell you that you've now had an opportunity to hear from Greg, who's a wealth of knowledge on Korea. You know, we haven't talked about this in public, and it's kind of, you know, nobody's here listening, so I'll tell you. Greg is getting ready to lead KEI. He's been chosen to be the executive director on the Committee for Human Rights in North Korea. He's going to do just an excellent job. So if we get into that realm and you have interest in that area, all the things that Greg told you today are not part of his job description. It's just kind of a hobby for him. So if you want to get into other areas, he's going to be a wealth of information for you. I think what I'd like to do is do something a little bit different and just tell you where my analytical thoughts are going with regard to North Korea. 3 years ago, you all may recall that the current leader of North Korea, Kim Jong-il, had a stroke in August of 2008. And I think the next morning I got called by you know, a news agency, and they're asking my opinions. And you know, I really didn't want to give it to them, knowing that things will change. But I've got to tell you that at that point in time, I didn't know how long he would survive, but my assumption was that this really might be the beginning of the end of the North Korean regime as we know it. That there had not been put in place a succession to another leader. He had not groomed anybody. You know, this, as you know, is a very strange anomaly for a socialist country to have a hereditary transfer of power from father to son. This happened between the current leader and his father. Kim Il-sung died, as you may recall, on the 8th of July, 1994. And his son, current leader, took over, but for about 3 years he was very cautious. He declared it to be a period of mourning, and he really didn't step forward. What he was doing was consolidating his power. That's an important point there, because in his particular case, he had been groomed for 20 years. He, in fact, was making the decisions and running the country on a day-to-day basis. But there was a question whether or not he would survive this transfer of power then, some 17 years ago now. And so when he had a stroke in August of 2008, the question became, how are they going to manage a successful transfer when there's no obvious leader? Those who looked as though they may gain a little power on their own. As an example, his brother-in-law, Jong Sung-taek. There was a point in time, I think around 2006 or so, when Kim Jong-il took a look at his brother-in-law and made a decision that he was amassing a little bit too much power in his own right. Sent him off to the coal mines, figuratively. He's been rehabilitated and he's now part of an inner circle. But the point being, there was no one on the horizon that would be able to take over. So as we're watching this development, we've seen over the last couple of years an accelerated effort by North Korea to put in place the potential successor to Kim Jong-il. Now, I want to deviate a little bit, and then I'll pick this story up. But you know, one of the things that you get the benefit of when you run your own organization is deciding what you're going to do. And so periodically I go to North Korea. And since the last time that I've been here in Cleveland, I've been 3 times. The most recent was in early November this past year, 6 months ago. And this was my 11th trip, and my wife was after me to take her. And so I did. Hey, happy birthday, we're going to go to Pyongyang. We went, and I had asked to go to their nuclear facility. I'd been there once before in January of 2004 with Dr. Sig Hecker, who is a former director of the National Laboratory. And in 2004, he and I and a couple of others, a small group, 3 or 4 of us there, were the first Americans into their reprocessing center. And it was a very interesting experience, and I'll just relay a couple things here. As we were going through and had gone through, the North Koreans, they wanted to send a message back with Dr. Hecker, and that is, we have successfully created a deterrent against the United States, because they had been working on their nuclear weapons program. And Dr. Hecker is very careful, and he said, well, you know, you can say that, but I don't know that. And their response is, hey, you want to see the stuff? And Dr. Hecker, you know, there's a couple of us there, Dr. Hecker's going, yes, and the rest of us are going, no. You know, and they bring out a little box into this small room, you know, and they put Rubbermaid gloves on, and I'm thinking, this is not going well. and they pull out a glass jar, and I'm thinking, you know, this looks awful like a mason jar here, and I'm really not comfortable here because I can see something inside the glass jar, and if it's what they say it is, plutonium metal, you know, how am I going to explain this, you know, to TSA when you go back to the airport? You know, it was an accident. I suspected this radioactivity, this gamma rays. You know, fortunately, Dr. Hecker knows what he's doing, and gamma rays don't penetrate glass. You know, and they said, well, you want to hold it? And he's saying yes, and we're going, no. But anyway, you know, he puts on the Rubbermaid orange glove, and fortunately, he didn't open it. He just picked it up. And afterwards, we were trying to ask him, you know, what was the value of that? You know, what can you get out of that? Well, he happens to be a plutonium specialist, and for him, the ability to pick that up, being able to judge the material inside and the weight, because plutonium metal is significantly denser and weighs more than some other type of metal. So he can make a judgment that, you know, it has the right feel for it. It also gives off heat, and so he can make that judgment even through the Rubbermaid gloves. The orange portion didn't bother the heat transfer, that there's an element of heat coming through there. So the North Koreans' point here is, we want you to go back and tell everyone in the U.S. government that we've succeeded in that. So it had been 6 years since I'd been there before, and I'd asked to go back. And they said, sure. And at that particular point in time, we had been seeing on satellite photography and some intelligence reporting that the North Koreans were constructing, there's something going on. There's a big hole in the ground, a new construction at their nuclear facilities at Yongbyon. That's not why I wanted to go, but that was a side interest. But for the North Koreans, that's why they wanted me to go. They knew in the next days or weeks that as they progressed with this construction, that the U.S. intelligence community would figure out what it was. So they were going to tell me, they were going to show me, so I could go back and tell the U.S. intelligence community what was going on in North Korea. Well, it turns out that they were building a light water reactor on their own. You know, and they started off, they brought a a specialist in from Pyongyang who I had met 6 years before, and he said, you know, you've already been here, so all I'm going to do is brief you on the changes that have taken place. And so he was going through this. Now, I am convinced that he had absolutely no authority, but in this discussion, as he was trying to tell me about the light water reactor that they were building, that I'm talking and asking him about other things about there. And out of that conversation came a bit of information that has since caused a great deal of consternation in other circles, that they had built on that site a uranium enrichment facility. Now, later on that evening, when I went back into Pyongyang and was talking to essentially our host, the Director General for North American Affairs, and I told him, I said, you know, listen, now that I know that you've got a uranium enrichment facility there, and he says, you what? I mean, this was not, I don't believe so. The first method is the one that we've been concerned with the North Koreans for quite some time, and that's the plutonium production, for which we've had agreements with them in place since 1994, since ruptured on that. But in 2002, we became suspicious that the North Koreans were secretly trying to move towards a secondary path to the production of nuclear weapons, and that is through highly enriched uranium. This is the same program that the Iranians have now. We confronted the North Koreans in October of 2002 over this. They essentially admitted to us and then denied publicly, and have been denying it ever since. So for them to reveal to me that in fact they had a uranium enrichment facility there at Yongbyon, that was big news. Now, for their point was, well, this is low enriched uranium. To create a nuclear weapon, you've got to go through this process of enriching uranium to a high degree, well over 80%, closer to 90% before it becomes fissile material. The low enriched uranium, around 3.5%, is used to create fuel, and this is what they're trying to tell us, that this is a facility that will provide the fuel to that light water reactor once it's built. Almost no one in the U.S. government believes that. It's not that that facility is not a low enriched uranium facility, but it suggests that they have had success in the high enrichment in someplace else, and this is a byproduct of what they were doing. But their intent here ultimately was, through the light water reactor construction, to convey a message to the United States. We're not standing still. We're moving forward. We are going to continue on in our preparations there. And I point this out because North Korea continues to be a serious concern to the United States. Josh mentioned some of the conventional concerns that we've had with the North Koreans in 2010, the sinking of the South Korean ship, the Chonan, the artillery shelling on Yongpyeong-do in South Korea as well. But for me, the more serious threat is the potential for proliferation. And there's a point in my professional career where I made one mistake, and that's with North Korea, in assuming that they fully understood that proliferation by North Korea of fissile material, a nuclear weapon, or the technology for that was a red line, whether it was fully articulated or not. I've had that conversation when in government with the North Koreans, essentially saying whether or not we find out immediately or years later, the fact of proliferation is so serious that there will be potentially military consequences, and that's something you don't want to do. And I was convinced, because of the North Koreans' reaction to the U.S. invasion of Iraq on the 19th of March in 2003, that they fully understood that there could be serious consequences. So I was not particularly concerned that the North Koreans would proliferate. Well, in fact, we found out in September of 2007 that's exactly what they did. You'll remember the news where the Israeli Air Force struck and destroyed a Syrian nuclear reactor that was being secretly built in a desert. It turns out that North Koreans were helping build this nuclear reactor, providing some oversight technology and perhaps even equipment for the Syrians. The problem that I have is that there was not any consequence from a U.S. point of view. We did nothing to the North Koreans. And in my mind, that is reinforced for the North Koreans that if they do the calculations, they can, if necessary, at a point in time in their choosing, continue the proliferation. Now, what's most disconcerting is when you take a look at this uranium facility that they revealed to me, and then a week later, I knew that Dr. Hecker was going back to North Korea. When I got into China from the trip, called him at his hotel, and we had a long discussion over this, pointing him towards this facility. The North Koreans allowed him to go in. He was stunned by the state of the art of the equipment. So when you think about this, that the potential connection between problems that the Iranians are having in their centrifuge program and the assistance that the North Koreans can provide for a price, and knowing the conditions of the country, that at some point in time they'll calculate whether the risk is worth it and could very well proliferate. That's very scary, because you then move from an isolated incident of North Korean possession of nuclear weapons to the spread of that technology and know-how to the Middle East. And that's not good news at all. Now, I started by saying that I began thinking that the stroke of Kim Jong-il in 2008 was the beginning of the end of North Korea. And I suggested there was an accelerated effort by the North Koreans to put in place a successor. That's exactly what they did. And up until recently, my thinking had changed, that they had done what they needed to do. They designated the third son, Kim Jong-un, to be the successor. They had put in place protectors for him. The brother-in-law that I mentioned, in 2009, the Constitution was amended. They expanded the controlling organization, when you take a look at anybody's government, you can pick out where the centers of power are. In North Korea is with the National Defense Commission. It had been up to that point, I think, a membership of about 6 military officers. They expanded it. They brought the brother-in-law, made him a member of the National Defense Commission. So you're thinking, they're putting someone there to protect the family, the third generation of Kims when they get into power. Later on, they made the brother-in-law the vice chairman of this National Defense Commission. When they came out in September of last year at their party conference, they started doing some things that normally take quite a while. Richard mentioned that I was in the military for a while. I spent 28 years there. After 28 years, I'd risen to the rank of colonel. Kim Jong-un, in one day, became a 4-star general. I'm thinking, I'm in the wrong army. And to boot that, Kim Jong-il decided that his son might get a little lonesome there as a 4-star, so he made his sister a 4-star general. So they're putting in place the rank and the positions, trying to ensure that there be some level of success. And so I began to think that well, if Kim Jong-il survives long enough, that this might actually work. And then I was charged with writing a very short paper for a conference next week in Korea. And after having written that, my opinion has reversed. I'm back now to share with you my newfound knowledge that I do think that this is not going to work. With all the efforts to put this kid is anywhere between 26 or 29. They are fuzzing up his age for obvious reasons. But the idea that you can parachute somebody into a military organization who has no experience, who has not been groomed, and in my opinion, if Kim Jong-il were to die in the next year or so the near term, I don't think it will succeed. I think that this kid will come in without a base of power on his own. He will make mistakes. He will be in a position where he is not able to negotiate with the United States, because the negotiations are there for two reasons. One, a reform of the society itself, and most importantly, the denuclearization of the peninsula. Those two things are anathema to the military. They're not going to allow him to do that, even if he had the inclination to do it, and I don't think that he does. So he's going to attempt, with the military's backing, to the status quo. Well, the status quo is on a downward spiral now, and I don't think it will last very long. I think he will make mistakes. I think the situation in North Korea will become more and more grim. It will deteriorate, and when that happens, I do believe that the military will remove the power. Whether they remove him is a different question or not. They may leave him there as a public figurehead with absolutely no power. So I want to wrap this up because, as I started to say, with as many experts in this audience, you're going to have some questions that are going to challenge us, and that's going to be the best part of this program. But for me, I would suggest, as you watch the developments in North Korea, that you will see, as Josh and Greg have laid out, an absolute alliance with South Korea that will allow us to continue to be very comfortable in our dealings with North Korea. And North Korea is going to be in a more and more difficult environment. And when that happens, it is, in my opinion, the beginning of the end of North Korea. Now, I don't know how long that will take. It may take a few years to happen. But it is not now, beyond the realm of the possibility that within our lifetime we will see a reunified Korean peninsula. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that wealth of information. Great presentation. And now we're going to be opening the question and answer session. We would ask that you wait for, if you have a question, please raise your hand, and Yana will come with the microphone. Also, if your question is directed to one of the particular members of the panel, please say so, just for any one of them, then say so that way too. So, our first question. Okay.
Ambassador Pritchard, I have a question for you. You said that people were stunned about the sophistication of the equipment. What was the source of that equipment? Where did it come from?
Well, let me set this up by saying in January, when I mentioned in January 2004, when Dr. Hecker, we went into their nuclear facilities, and I asked him, because I was looking at this and it didn't impress me, and he said, this stuff looks like the former Soviet Union of the 1950s. It's functional, but it's not very sophisticated. So that's his context of the capabilities of the North Koreans. So he went into this facility and he said, you know, he was just stunned by how modern it was, etc. The North Koreans would have you believe that they have built it on their own there, and to some degree that they have. Their centrifuge program, and this is what the uranium enrichment facility is about, really began with their relationship with Pakistan. The Pakistanis, in building their own nuclear program, stole the plans, designs, etc., from the European Urenco facility. And in exchange for assistance with the North Koreans on missiles, we believe that the Pakistanis provided the North Koreans, you know, ballpark figure about 20 P2, or a Pakistani version of this centrifuge. Sometime mid to late 1990s, in which they, you know, continued on their own to try to purchase the specialty equipment. And we had believed over the years that they had not been successful. There's an assumption that they were on that road, but it's pretty difficult to do. And there had been some interceptions of equipment, successful interceptions. And so we weren't quite certain to what level of sophistication they had done. So, you know, to answer your question directly, we don't exactly know. The North Koreans would have you believe they've done it on their own, but clearly there is some reverse engineering involved in terms of the Pakistani design. There's been some overseas purchases, and you know, when you take a look at the intelligence, the work ethic of all Koreans, that it is not out of the realm of possibility that they did this themselves. But we just haven't pulled that thread to find out what level of assistance they may have had on the outside.
Ambassador Pritchard, also I have a question for you. You ended your comment with the combination of statements that I found very interesting, that you saw a great potential for failure in the evolved in the changing of the guard in North Korea, and then I was kind of expecting you to go in the direction of the military being in control and being more dangerous, but instead you changed the outcome of that failure to a reunification of the peninsula. So I'm curious if your perception then is that that there is a huge desire, a broad-based desire amongst the military and those, I guess, who have the potential to be in power if the current regime fails to negotiate a reunification. Is that what I'm hearing?
No, I shouldn't have left that impression. I think the opposite is probably the case, that because of the history, the society, the lack of information, particularly the lack of contact with the North Korean military in the outside world, with some minor exceptions in their relationship with China and their former relationship with the former Soviet Union. My comment very specifically would be that the military, when put in charge, will fail. They will not be able to run the country. Now, that's a little bit more complex than just saying that at some point in time there's going to be a mistake, the military will be in trouble, there'll be an uprising. I can't go in that direction because from what we know of the information flow in North Korea, the people are not wired, if you will. There are no particular cell phones for which they can converse outside of their own area. They don't get news. The radio channels are all preset. They have no clue what's going on in the Middle East and whatnot. But I think that the continuing situation, the economic situation, is one in which the military is ill-equipped. And when you have that combination of failures of the economy, a continuation of the food shortages, and a lack of central authority that has been there for some 60-some years in the form of only 2 leaders there, I think at that point you'll begin to see the unraveling of North Korea. And as I said, it's going to take quite a while. Well, it could take quite a while, whether that's over a couple of year period or not. But I don't think they can survive. And this is, as I say, an evolving opinion of mine. At one point, not too long ago, I had been in a different direction. But I'm now at the point where I don't think Kim Jong-un is equipped to do it, is prepared to do it, nor will be given much chance to lead in the same way that his father and grandfather did, knowing that the level of popular support, if Kim Il-sung had the adoration of the population, Kim Jong-il's level of adoration is very artificial and very, very precarious. Trying to pass it on to a 3rd generation, I don't see it happening. And so there's not going to be any popular support for this young man as well.
Greg had mentioned the unions in passing, and I was just wondering, since the unions now are going to have a play in our political environment that they haven't had for decades, what is the union situation in Korea? Are public teacher unions common there? Is it a similar situation where there's no check on them? Or, what about the industrial unions? How do they affect the cutbacks that must have taken place in the economic recovery?
Certainly. As you know, South Korean unions tend to be very vocal. They have been vocal over the years. However, the unionization rate is surprisingly low, at about 10.8% right now. There are two major umbrella unions, the KCTU and the FKTU. One of them has been more reasonable, collaborating with the current administration and with the majority party, the Grand National Party, speaking about retrenchment. They actually sat down, there was tripartite dialogue following the 2008 crisis, employers, unions, one of the umbrella trade unions, and government, and agreed to engage primarily in job sharing. And job sharing was the secret to retaining a lot of jobs in Korea. Basically, the unemployment rate was maintained relatively low, at just about 4%. Unemployment amongst younger people is higher because they tend to be very selective once they graduate from college. What is the situation of trade unions in Korea and where are they going? What about the teachers' unions? The teachers' unions, of course, teachers, public employees are now technically allowed to unionize. And this was an issue that Korea had for a long time with the International Labor Organization. Some of the teachers' unions are not recognized in Korea for a very simple reason. Public employees are allowed to unionize, but they're not allowed to engage in political activities. Some of the public employee union members joined the Democratic Party of Korea, which is the main opposition party right now, and ran for office. Actually, in the Korean parliament, there are representatives of both major parties, the GNP and the DP, who were labor union leaders. So that is the reason why these unions were not recognized, not because they're unions of public employees, but because some of their members engaged in political activities and that they're not allowed to do that. Now, if one talks to labor in Korea, labor will complain that the government is biased against labor. If one talks to one of the major employers' unions, they will complain that there are a lot of labor leaders, even within the GNP, within the ruling party, and they are biased against employers. So this scene continues to be very active. But nevertheless, what is also happening is that the Korean public has grown tired of very militant union activity. And even union leaders themselves admit that, for example, European unions are also very active and very vocal, but they know how to focus their resources on the main issues for decades now. I'm not saying that the union played an extraordinary role in Korea's democratic development. Of course, sometimes they have to be vocal because union leaders have to prove themselves, have to prove their worth by organizing industrial action. But Korea has come a very long way on the labor front, and basically Korea is in full compliance with most of the 8 ILO core conventions. There are still a couple of pending issues, but good work is being done on those as well.
Ambassador, how influential is China in these critical areas that we talked about, the economics, the military aggressiveness, the nuclear program, and to the extent that they are influential, what motivates them to allow this to go to a place where it can be very unstable in the region? Why are they motivated this way?
Yeah, it's an excellent question, and obviously the answer is very complex, but let's try to tackle it in the period of time we have here. The relationship with North Korea and China is, in in some cases, a love-hate relationship. There are elements within the Chinese government that have a very close relationship, particularly within the Communist Party of China. International Liaison Division is really in charge of China's policies towards North Korea, and that's where the deep connection is. There's a split within the Chinese government. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs are not so enamored by that, but they haven't won out in this discussion. So in general, the Chinese can be characterized as being sympathetic and leaning towards the North Koreans in general. Then you take a look at the specifics of the relationship, and for China, when it comes to North Korea, their top priority, absolute top priority, is the stability along their border. And anything that will seriously contribute to the unraveling of North Korea and the potential of the chaos that could occur in terms of refugee flow back and forth is something that the Chinese are not going to contribute to. You would be asking them to go against their own national interest by trying to more forcefully control or provide some type of leverage against the North Koreans. The North Koreans have tested that relationship throughout their most recent history. When, as an example, when they first conducted their first nuclear test in October of 2006, the Chinese were furious. I mean, they were publicly telling the North Koreans, don't do it. The North Koreans did it anyway. Now, for the North Koreans, they understand the situation with China. So as the Chinese come to them and they admonish them, the North Koreans essentially said, okay, let's go back to talks. We're prepared to go back to talks. And for the Chinese, it's just like somebody has turned the safety valve, and all the stress drains out of the Chinese, because getting the North Koreans back into a general discussion, in this case six-party talks, is what they want. And from a Chinese perspective, they believe if the North Koreans are involved in the talks, they're less likely to do things that they don't like. Josh mentioned the two incidences that occurred in 2010. The Chinese were in a very difficult situation. They understood the fragility of the North Korean regime during this period of time after Kim Jong-il's stroke, as they were trying to put together their succession plan, and for the Chinese to come out and condemn the North Koreans or do something along the lines that the United Nations would like to have done could very well have tipped the scale in a situation the Chinese didn't want. So the Chinese either kept quiet or challenged the conclusions of the South Koreans. That has caused a bit of a diplomatic rift between the South Koreans and the Chinese. It's a complex arrangement where the Chinese have the same concerns about the North Koreans' nuclear weapons program. They don't want them to have one, but any effort on their part to use their leverage to force that issue will go against their more senior or top priority for stability, and they're just not going to do it. That's what's guided them in their relationship publicly with North Korea and the rest of us, and they're suffering for it.
I may not be wrong in thinking that all our panelists share the following presupposition, namely that the U.S. has the intention of staying in the region as the Pacific power, and also the U.S. has the power to do so. I think each part of this presupposition can be questioned in light of recent international politics and in light of the economic issues this country is facing. And there is another factor that we might as well address, China. China has been mentioned. I may be right in thinking that the Chinese have their own paradigm for the world. And they view the world through that paradigm. What is that paradigm? It's a paradigm of the Middle Kingdom. And I think it is not an exaggeration reason to say that the Chinese policy in the world, and especially in that region, is becoming increasingly imperialistic. So South Korea, a small country compared to China, will come under enormous pressure to accommodate Chinese interests. And more than that, Japan, I think, is looking and waiting. So maybe it is too fast of an assumption to think that Japan will keep loyal to this country. So there are many factors. In fact, the future structure of the geopolitical map of East Asia depends so many factors other than the fortunate prosperity of South Korea and the friendship between the U.S. and South Korea. Of course, as a South Korean, Korean American, I am very much encouraged by your presentations. I hope what you think is correct. I have some concerns.
Yeah, sure. I can just make a couple statements first, and then anyone else can feel free to jump in. All great points, and these are things that that people spend a lot of time in Washington thinking about and planning for. First, on the broader issue of U.S. engagement in the Pacific, it's impossible to speak, in the infinite future. But I can certainly say for this administration, there's no question that this administration is completely committed to engagement in Asia. In fact, it's particularly made engagement with its allies, U.S. allies in Asia, the cornerstone of its policy, of our policy, U.S. policy in Asia. And particularly that means Japan, and Korea, Australia, and then to an important but lesser extent, Philippines, Thailand, and so on. But it's true that, especially in this economic time, for the first time, you are hearing discussions about, well, is it worth what we spend for our troops overseas in places like Japan and Korea? Are we getting, are the host countries sharing the burden evenly? Because, both Korea and Japan do pay to support those troops to some extent, but could they pay more? You're starting to hear those discussions to an extent that you hadn't heard before. So in theory, that chorus of voices could grow, but it's absolutely a minority at this point, and certainly in our government now, there's absolutely no move in that direction. On the broader issue of China, there's also an incredibly interesting set of points that you raised there. One issue the United States is faced with is how do we engage with China relative to the other countries in the region? If we engage too closely with China, sometimes we get accused of we're trying to do a kind of G2, so China and U.S., kind of condominium over all of Asia, and sort of between the two of us, we're going to decide how well of Asia policy. No one wants that. On the other hand, if we're not engaging with China, then we might get accused of, well, why are you heading towards conflict with China? Why aren't you talking more? Why aren't you reaching more agreement? So it is a fine line that we have to balance. But broadly, I think that's why where U.S. policy is to really focus on the alliances, to focus on our long, deep, broad alliances with countries like Korea and countries like Japan, and bring those countries closer together. One encouraging thing that we've seen is Japan and South Korea doing more and more together recently. For example, last year in December, we had one of it was actually the first ever in Washington, a trilateral ministerial level conference with Secretary Clinton and the two foreign ministers of Japan and Korea met in Washington, specifically to discuss North Korea, but also to discuss a range of other issues. So I wouldn't say that it's China pulling apart the alliances. If anything, right now, there seems to be an extent where Chinese actions are pushing all of the other countries in Asia closer together and to an extent closer to us. I'd just say one final point on that, and that was the Yongpyong incident. That, as the ambassador mentioned, put China in a very difficult spot because basically South Korea was asking China, will you condemn this attack, this shelling of Yongpyong Island that killed civilians? and China wouldn't. Essentially, it was a very difficult spot for them, but they made a political judgment that they couldn't condemn North Korea. And that was a signal that was heard throughout the rest of Asia that, you know, look, this is a China that, I mean, it was sort of a black and white case. Civilians were killed. Now, the other, you know, there's a lot of other provocations you can sort of make a, judgment call on. But young shelling was killed civilians. It was clearly an attack that's hard to justify. And so for a lot of other countries in the region, they looked at China and it made them quite wary that maybe this is a China that won't just call them as they see them, so to speak, but will really just follow its own ideological and national interests when making judgments on the other countries in the region. So I think all the points you raised are very valid. I think that to many, it's something that really our administration is very focused on. But I think right now, if anything, I see more positive trends in the way that Chinese behavior is actually drawing our allies closer together. Anything else to add on that?
Just one very quick point about values. Of course, there have been a lot of shared values over the past 5,000 years of Korean history between Korea and China. Nevertheless, South Korea is a liberal democracy that respects human rights and other universally accepted values. This is a major difference, I would say, although the Chinese economy, the PRC economy might have developed spectacularly over the past few decades. So certainly South Korea shares in these global and international values and will continue to share these values. You may remember that all of us remember that in the 19th century, what truly made the difference as far as Japan was concerned was that unfortunately, unlike Korea and China, Japan sent the Iwakura mission, a group of bright young men around the world that collected information about developed nations, came back, Japan industrialized, modernized. Unfortunately, things turned really badly once it became militarized, and we all know about the very sad legacy of Japanese imperialism. And just because Korea suffered tremendously for 40 years because of that, Korea will know how to draw the very positive and forward-looking lessons from its being a very open, globalized country and society that fully respects universally accepted values.
Thank you very, very much. Our program this evening was part of the Future of Korea series that's provided as a collaboration from the Korean Economic Institute, the World Affairs Councils of America, United States State Department, and provide this opportunity to a number of World Affairs Councils throughout the country. So we were very fortunate. Our local person who took care of everything is John, so appreciate that. Again, we thank you very, very much, and we would like to present you a small memento of your experience here, and hopefully you'll remember Cleveland. Ambassador, it's good to welcome you back, and we hope to see you again. Greg, thank you very much, first time here, but we congratulate you and wish you the best on your new position. Hopefully you'll come back here in that position and talk with us. And Josh, welcome home.
Yes.
And hopefully on your journeys back home, we'll stop in and we can have some other programs with you. So again, thank you very much. Thank you to all of you for being here this evening. Remember our programs coming up. The one is June 3rd, and then our June 15th is our annual meeting. This meeting is adjourned. Thank you.